black night satellite, Earth orbit, unknown. And by the time understanding catches up, the original sighting has already been folded into contradiction. In those cases, what remains is not certainty, but repetition. The same claim resurfacing across decades. The same images reinterpreted. The same fragments of data re-examined under new assumptions that never fully resolve what was first observed. But because it refuses to disappear into either category cleanly, it begins depending on which account you follow, long before modern spaceflight. There are references sometimes linked to early radio experiments in the 20th century. Others point further back to unexplained astronomical observations recorded in fragmented notes that were never intended to support anything like a unified theory. And then there is the version that begins with noise. A signal, not dramatic at first, not structured, just an anomaly in the background of radio monitoring, an irregular pattern that did not match known terrestrial or atmospheric sources. In the early years of radio science, Earth itself was still learning how to listen. Signals bounced unpredictably through the ionosphere. Equipment was inconsistent. Interpretation was fragile. Almost anything unusual could be dismissed as interference. But some signals do not behave like interference. They behave like repetition. And repetition is what makes attention sharpen. By the time this story begins to solidify into what people now recognize as the Black Knight satellite hypothesis, the narrative has already split into multiple competing origins. One version claims that in the early 20th century, Nikola Tesla detected unusual repeating signals while experimenting with radio receivers, signals that he believed may have originated from space rather than Earth. Another version attributes similar observations to later radio engineers who noticed structured interference patterns that seemed too deliberate to be natural noise. Neither version can be confirmed in a strict documentary sense. They introduce the idea that something above Earth may have been transmitting or reflecting signals long before humanity expected anything artificial to exist in orbit. The real shift in the story, however, does not happen on Earth. It happens when humanity begins to leave it. When early space missions started sending equipment beyond the atmosphere, the expectation was simple. Space would be empty in any structured sense. Debris might exist. Natural objects might be encountered. But anything artificial would have a clear origin point tied to human activity. That assumption held until anomalies began to appear in tracking data. Unexplained objects, unregistered mass, irregular orbital behavior, and most importantly, something that did not immediately resolve into a known satellite, rocket fragment, or predictable celestial body. The reports were inconsistent at first. Early space tracking was still developing. Radar resolution was limited. Optical confirmation was unreliable. But over time, a pattern formed in the margins of those inconsistencies. It was described as elongated in some accounts, tumbling slowly in others, absorbing more light than it reflected, making it difficult to image clearly against the background of space. And because it resisted classification, it accumulated interpretation. Some technicians referred to it informally as the Black Knight, but as a descriptive label that captured its visual impression: dark, silent, and persistent. The problem with orbital anomalies is that they do not remain isolated once attention is drawn to them. Once a possibility enters the system, every piece of data is re-examined through it. Archival photographs were reviewed. Tracking logs were compared. Signal recordings were analyzed again, under the assumption that something unregistered might have been present for longer than originally believed. That is why the narrative begins to shift from astronomy into something closer to pattern recognition under uncertainty. Because once you accept that something might be there, you begin to see it in more places. The most persistent element of the Black Knight hypothesis is not any single image or signal, but the suggestion of structured transmission. Radio anomalies that appear directional rather than random. Repeating bursts that do not correspond to known satellite communication schedules. And reports from various monitoring stations that describe short-lived interference patterns that feel too consistent to be purely environmental. None of these reports exist in a unified, verified dataset, and fragments are what allow interpretation to grow. By the late 20th century, amateur researchers and independent analysts began collecting these fragments into a single narrative that an unknown object had been in Earth orbit for an extended period, potentially predating human space activity. This is where the story becomes unstable, because the more it is assembled into coherence, the more it begins to rely on assumptions that cannot be independently verified. Appear to show a dark object against the curvature of Earth. These images are often enhanced, reprocessed, or interpreted differently depending on the source. In some versions, the object appears sharply defined. In others, it is indistinct, barely distinguishable from sensor noise or debris. It is interpretive persistence, the ability of an image to survive doubt, not proof, but reinterpretation. As the space age advanced, satellite tracking became more precise. The number of known objects in orbit increased dramatically. Human activity filled near-Earth space with predictable clutter: communication satellites, weather systems, defunct hardware, and mission debris. Within that expanding catalog, anomalies became harder to isolate, not because they disappeared, but because they were absorbed into noise. And yet the Black Knight hypothesis did not disappear. Instead, it adapted. It shifted from specific identification to persistent uncertainty. Rather than claiming a single confirmed object, it began to represent the possibility that something unclassified might still be present in orbital data, hidden not by invisibility, but by classification complexity. At this stage, the story becomes less about what is physically in space and more about what is missing from certainty. Some remain unresolved due to insufficient data resolution or conflicting readings. And within that unresolved space, interpretation persists. It suggests something simpler, continuity, that something may have remained in orbit, unchanged in purpose or state, while everything around it changed dramatically. Earth evolved technologically. Humanity filled its orbital environment with structures and systems, observed intermittently, but never fully integrated into official catalogs. In more speculative interpretations, the Black Knight becomes less an object and more a question about perception in high-noise environments. If enough data exists and enough anomalies are present, at what point does uncertainty itself become indistinguishable from structure? If a pattern appears across incomplete datasets, is it real or constructed by the act of searching? These questions are not answered in the narrative. They are embedded within it. Because the Black Knight story survives not through resolution, but through recurrence. Each generation rediscovers it in a new form. Early radio experiments, space tracking anomalies, internet-era reinterpretations. Each layer adds detail while removing certainty. And in that accumulation, the object becomes less defined but more persistent. A combination of misidentified satellites, debris, and reinterpretation of old data. Official explanations tend to emphasize known objects, sensor artifacts, and the limitations of early observational technology. But even within those explanations, there is an acknowledgement that not all historical anomalies were fully documented in a way that allows complete reconstruction. And that absence of closure is where the narrative continues to breathe. Because the Black Knight does not need to be confirmed to remain relevant. It only needs to remain unresolved. As long as there are gaps in orbital certainty, it exists as possibility rather than object. And possibility is harder to eliminate than fact. In the end, the story does not resolve into a clear statement about whether something is or is not orbiting Earth outside human classification. Instead, it settles into a quieter tension, a recognition that modern systems, no matter how advanced, still rely on interpretation of incomplete data. And within that space between detection and understanding, the idea of the Black Knight persists, not as a confirmed satellite, not as a proven artifact, but as a reminder that above Earth, even in the most monitored environment humanity has ever created, there are still points of uncertainty that refuse to collapse fully into explanation. And as long as those points remain, the question remains with them. Not whether something is there, but whether everything that is there has been correctly understood.